The objective today is to describe the topics covered in the Debian Administrator Handbook, and I will particularly show you what we should do right before installing and then kind of walk you through some of the options for installation. But when it comes through the click-through, I'm sure there's lots of videos out there already on how to do that, so I'd suggest you watch those. But what I'm doing here is just pulling straight from that Debian Administrator Handbook. So right before migrating, what should you do? They say it is wise to retain the configuration of every identified service in order to be able to install the equivalent on the updated server. So you don't want to get in trouble with your boss there as system administrator who came up with the great idea to move everything to Debian. They go on to say that the bare minimum is to make a backup copy of the configuration files. So that's just something you should always do, backup everything, not just your configuration files. And take it from me, you want to make your heart love configuration files because these sure will save you a lot of pain and time and heartache and everything. And don't you like my picture here? Aren't we excited? We are going through finally installing Debian today. Think of that picture as the system administrator with the boss carrying him through. So where are these configuration files you need? It says for Unix machines, the configuration files are usually in the etc folder, but they may be located in a subdirectory of the user \local or /. I always say those wrong in the first time. So user /local. This is the case if a program has been installed from sources rather than with a package. In some cases, one may also find them under the opt folder. So let's keep it simple here. Where are the configuration files? I wonder if anyone sees the hint I was providing them with right there. It looks like my highlighter carried over to this slide. Never slide while writing, I guess. Before you answered where are configuration files usually found, now you can answer the exact same question completely worded differently. What can you find in etc? And that would just be the answer to that would be the question itself previously. Isn't it great being a student of mine, so confused so often? Oh, and you know what I would suggest? It's fun to just search for things on a system. So if you're on a Linux system, go ahead and CD your way into these folders and just take a look around. Don't forget, sometimes files are hidden, so you might have to reveal that. And of course, you have Google, so if you see anything that you can't make a good inference on, go ahead and just Google it. So here we go. Remember, you're the system administrator, and you may choose to completely reinstall the computer's system to ensure optimal compatibility with the software provided by Debian. So I think they're saying this kind of in the sense that maybe you already have a Debian, in which case I'm going to show you something specifically you can do. But just this sentence kind of gave me the heebie-jeebies. I'm wondering, how often does this happen where you just for fun reinstall the entire computer system just in case? It just seemed like such an awkward sentence in this handbook. Well, before doing that, before wiping anything or deleting anything, you might want to also try this command of Cruft. When I first learned about this, I thought, like, could this be something that's a CTF thing someday that might help me? Because I had never heard of Cruft before reading this handbook, so. They say the Cruft package proposes to list the available files that are not owned by any package. It has some filters, so more or less effective and more or less up to date, and to avoid reporting some legitimate files, so that's what the filters are for. It doesn't want to report files generated by Debian packages or generated configuration files not managed by that Debian package manager there. And just as a warning, they say, be careful not to blindly delete everything that Cruft might list. And you know what's funny? The first image that popped up when I did some individual research on Cruft was a picture of this little dog right here. And I mean, he or she looks like its name is Cruft. The next part of the handbook just reminds you that there are differences in the architectures of your processor. So of course you're making sure you have the right ISO file. AMD 64 architecture should work just fine with an EM64T processor. It's because Intel and AMD play games to try to one-up each other. You know, Intel was the first to make an x86 architecture processor, and then AMD was the first to get a working x86 64-bit architecture going. When you see i386 in this handbook, it looks like they're just saying like your good old-fashioned x86 32-bit processor. So to answer my own questions here, like there's no differences, or if there is, it is really, really small, and I wonder what those specifically are. But when you see this word, this is just Intel trying to rename pretty much the exact same architecture that AMD named after trying to make themselves seem cooler. Well, let's wrap this video up by talking a little bit about installation. So by now we are on chapter 4. What you need in terms of a computer is, it goes from really simple, so maybe bare bones Debian would ask you for 80 megabytes of RAM and 700 megabytes of a hard drive, but it does say here that what's recommended for a basic Office desktop would be this 5 gigabytes of a hard drive and 512 megabytes of RAM. So when you go to install this in your computer, that is really the minimum you should be having. Now here's the part where I said, be careful. If you already have Weezy, I guess it's called, or if you have any of these older versions of Debian, you don't need to uninstall and reinstall the whole thing. You could just update. And they even suggest you do this because reinstalling, in addition to being unnecessary, it could be dangerous. So the whole upgrade process is described in this section. You can jump to it or wait for me to get to it. But the point is, if you're sitting here and you got Weezy, which reminds me of the band Weezer, really great song, Island in the Sun, and you want to upload to or upgrade to Jesse, which, hilarious, this is old and this is new. But down here, this is newer and this is older. But the point is you are upgrading from Weezy to Jesse, not just installing Jesse. Another humorous moment here, if you're doing this from CDs, apparently it takes 84 of them. You can also install from a USB, and I'm sharing this one because the command to do that, like once you plug your USB in and you're on the command line, like this is what you type. I thought that was kind of cool. So after you identify the device name, and there's their example, the simplest means to do this is to check the messages issued by the kernel using the dmessage command. Then you must copy the previously downloaded ISO image. For example, there's the name of the ISO with the command, and then there's that command. So you're sitting at your computer with a fresh ISO downloaded from, let's say, the internet. You put in your USB drive, you dmessage command to find out what it's called, and then you would type in cat and the ISO, point arrow to that USB. And explaining to students why the command cat stands for concatenate and has nothing to do with actual cats is really hard. But if I use my example of a file called crap and have them type cat crap, it probably actually just confuses them even more. Well, anyways, that's not the only way, a USB that is, to install Debian. You could also do it from the network, which is pretty cool. I mean, PXE or TFTP boot is the names of these methods in which you sort of jumpstart your system or a computer, by using the network. So far we've talked about USB booting and now network booting. Once you're booting from one of these ways, you're using a bootloader, which is a low-level program responsible for booting the Linux kernel, and this is happening just after BIOS passes it off. So for this to happen, it must be able to locate the Linux kernel to boot on the disk. On the i386 and AMD 64 architectures, the two most used programs to perform this task are Lilo, the older of the two, but Grub is the new cool kid on the block, the more modern replacement. And I thought of this Grub. I wonder if you guys were thinking more along the lines of Grubhub, but that's what Grub is there to do. It's a bootloader program. And that's it for the video. In the next one, we'll go ahead and talk about configuration.